I will tell you today about a monk who secluded himself in the cellar of a dark monastery to make a medicine for immortality, but instead gave humanity the instrument of annihilation. A simple British scholar who left the chance of the Church to dive into the secrets of alchemy for more than 50 years. What was it that drove Roger Bacon to search for the elixir of life among barrels of sulfur and salt? How did a chemical coincidence in the cellar of the monastery turn into the greatest military discovery in history? What is the secret code he used to hide the recipe for gunpowder from the eyes of the curious? How was this black powder able to shatter the walls of fortresses that had stood firm for centuries? What is the connection between the smell of rotten eggs and the appearance of the first cannon on battlefields? How did gunpowder end the age of chivalry and nobles with a single pull of the trigger? Who was the German monk who lost his sight while trying to tame the demonic fire? How did Constantinople fall before the metal destroyers made by the chemists? What is the secret that made wooden ships own the world and open unknown continents? How did church bells turn into the mouths of cannons that spewed flames and smoke? What happened in the Battle of Crécy when the sound of artificial thunder was heard for the first time? How did stone balls develop into cluster bombs that tear bodies apart? What did Alfred Nobel do to complete the monk's cursed journey? And how did the monk's search for immortality reach the nuclear mushroom cloud in Hiroshima? Why did the Church imprison its scholar after he had given it the weapon of absolute control? And how did the monk die alone among his manuscripts that burned the world? He is the man who changed the course of history without carrying a sword, the keeper of the secret that brought down empires. The genius monk, Roger Bacon. From the depths of his laboratory came the first hints of a secret mixture that could turn still air into violent fire and invisible gas into crushing power. To protect his knowledge from curious and dangerous eyes, he wrapped his formula in riddles and hidden ciphers so that only a careful reader could understand the amounts and proportions. This black powder would one day break the stone walls of castles that had stood for centuries against every siege. It would end the age of shining armor and mounted nobles with a single pull of a trigger, turning courage into smoke and iron instead of skill at the sword. The smell that rose from his early experiments was like the smell of rotten eggs, heavy with sulfur that burned the throat and stung the eyes. From that harsh smell and from those trembling hands came the first steps toward the birth of cannons and the thunder of artificial storms on battlefields. Other monks followed this path, such as the German monk Berthold Schwarz, who, according to many accounts, built one of the first crude cannons. Their work prepared the way for the fall of mighty cities, such as Constantinople, under the blows of huge bombards cast from molten metal and fed with that same black powder. The mixture would give wooden ships the power to rule oceans and open unknown continents, as iron mouths spat fire from their flanks and tore the waves with force. Church bells that once called people to prayer were melted and recast into cannon tubes that spat flame and smoke instead of sound. In the Battle of Crécy, the sound of this new thunder rolled for the first time across a European field, frightening soldiers and animals and breaking the steady rhythm of old-style war. Stone balls would gradually evolve into deadly projectiles that broke apart into fragments, the early ancestors of cluster shells that shredded bodies instead of striking only a single point. Centuries later, Alfred Nobel would carry the same line of thought further, taming the violence of explosions into sticks of dynamite that could shape mountains or destroy armies at will. From the dark cellar of a medieval monk to the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, the story of this powder became a long chain that connected the search for immortality with the technology of absolute destruction. The church that had once trusted its learned monk later imprisoned him, afraid of the power of the ideas and the substances he had released. He died alone among his manuscripts, surrounded by pages that would help to set the world on fire, a man who had changed the course of history without ever lifting a sword. In the 13th century of the Common Era, the world still lived in a kind of technical darkness that depended on the sharpness of steel and the strength of human arms. Alchemy was the ruling art, a mixture of magic, philosophy, and primitive attempts at chemistry, in which sages tried to read the hidden language of nature in fumes and crystals. In this scene, the English Franciscan monk Roger Bacon appeared, regarded by many European historians as a spiritual father of the discovery of gunpowder in the West. He spent almost all his time in a dim laboratory inside his monastery, absorbed in his search for an elixir that would grant long life and for the legendary philosopher's stone. In the year 1242, he wrote in a famous manuscript known as the Great Work about a strange chemical blend that caught his attention. Before this moment, the world relied on catapults, bows, and arrows, and on high stone walls designed to resist traditional sieges for hundreds of years. Bacon did not intend to create a killing machine. He was simply testing how saltpeter potassium nitrate would react when mixed with sulfur and charcoal from burned wood. When he combined these three materials in certain proportions, a tremendous explosion occurred, unlike anything Europe had seen before, and he felt for a moment that he had touched some hidden demonic force. The historian Geoffrey Barraclough wrote that this discovery changed the course of military history forever and broke the balance of power that had existed for centuries. Other historians also point to a German monk named Berthold Schwarz, whom some consider the first to turn this powder into a true canon after the basic mixture was already known. The book History of Technology by Charles Singer explains that gunpowder itself likely traveled to the west along the Silk Road from China, where it had been used for fireworks and ritual displays. Yet the Central European contribution of the monks was to purify potassium nitrate to a much higher quality and to refine the mixture until it became an enormous explosive force instead of a mere flash. Many alchemists believed that sulfur represented the spirit and matter, and that rock salt represented the body. So the blend of these substances with charcoal was seen as an attempt to create a new living entity. In 13th century manuscripts, the sound of the blast is described like a heavenly thunder that splits mountains and shakes the earth beneath one's feet. Armies slowly began to abandon the image of the fully armored knight of the Middle Ages because heavy metal plates no longer guaranteed safety against lead and iron shot. In the year 1268, records from the Abbey at Oxford mention one of the earliest documented uses of a formula that closely resembled true gunpowder in chemical research. The historian Will Durant wrote in his work Story of Civilization that this invention ended the age of feudal fortresses, because cannons could at last crack the proud walls of stone keeps. The proportions that Bacon and those who followed him eventually reached were about 77% potassium nitrate, 13% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. He did not understand then that his personal quest for a way to preserve the body and extend life would lead to one of the most effective machines for tearing bodies apart. After that moment the world was no longer the same, for power moved from the hand that held the strongest sword to the hand that controlled the cannon with the longest reach. Sources say that Roger Bacon felt the danger of what he had found and was forced to hide the real formula in his writings using coded language. He used clever word puzzles and rearranged phrases so that the untrained reader could not easily see the true measurements and ingredients inside the recipe. This discovery would later show its full effect in the Battle of Crécy, where early forms of artillery were used in real combat for the first time in Europe. The military historian Peter Barrett notes that the thick smoke that covered the fields looked like a shroud drawing itself over the old ages while a new and darker era of war was being born. All these reactions took place in simple ceramic vessels, under the faint light of candles in the cellars of monasteries. The smell of burning powder resembled the smell of rotten eggs because of the heavy sulfur content that filled the air and clung to clothing and stone. So the dream of eternal life quietly turned into a reality filled with the roar of guns and the blood of wars that swept across the old continent. The journey from the isolated laboratory of a monk to the blazing fields of battle was not just a technical step. It was a cosmic earthquake that shifted the foundations of the inhabited world. Between the years that the sources describe as 1860, 5 and 1395 of the Common Era, the world witnessed one of the most dangerous changes in the history of weapons. Before this age, people lived in a slower world where death could reach only as far as an arrow shot from a drawn bow. Then this monk, driven by pure scientific curiosity, found himself standing in front of what witnesses called infernal fire that spared nothing and left nothing behind. The historian George Sarton, in his History of Science, notes that in those days monks were almost the only people who had the luxury of reading, writing, and carrying out experiments. When Bacon discovered that the pressure of trapped gases could be used to push objects at high speed, the idea slowly seeped into the minds of rulers and kings. Imagine the sight of knights in bright metal armor staring in disbelief at a simple iron tube that spat flame and thick black smoke. In 1324, a manuscript appeared that showed a primitive cannon shaped like a large vase that launched a thick metal bolt. The French historian Fernand Braudel wrote that gunpowder did not only kill people, it also killed the old social order that had protected nobles for centuries. Before this invention, the feudal lord could feel almost absolute safety behind castle walls 5 meters thick that took decades to build. Once cannons arrived, those same walls that needed years of labor to raise could crumble within hours of concentrated bombardment. Bravery was no longer measured only by skill with the blade. It became tied to wealth and the ability to buy metals and pay for chemical materials. Historical estimates suggest that the cost of a single war increased roughly tenfold after the secret technique of the monk entered the field of battle. Bacon himself warned in his letters that this substance could destroy entire armies in the blink of an eye. In 1345, the Italian chronicler Giovanni Villani described the sound of cannons in the Battle of Crécy and how the sudden thunder terrified war horses and broke the charge. At first, bombs were not like the shells we know today. They were stone balls wrapped in cloth, soaked with powder. When these balls exploded, they hurled shards of stone and bits of metal in all directions, ripping through anything they struck without mercy. The world also passed through a psychological transition because many people felt that this new weapon was not honorable since it killed from a distance. Imagine the dense dust filling the workshops of the monks as they ground charcoal and sulfur by hand for many hours. Poisonous fumes rose upward and choked their breath, yet they continued their work to improve a mixture that grew more deadly each year. Geoffrey Barraclough points out in his studies that China had known gunpowder as a source of festive fire and color, but the European monk turned it into a pure kinetic force. This ability to turn chemical energy into movement allowed European ships later on to colonize distant lands, once they were equipped with rows of cannon along their sides. Details of saltpeter manufacture required gathering organic waste and letting it ferment for long months under special environmental conditions. The monk then boiled this liquid and filtered it again and again until he obtained pure white crystals that looked like snow. Inside those crystals were oxygen-rich particles that made it possible for explosions to occur even when there was little or no air from outside. In the year 1389, one of the earliest recorded explosions of a large gunpowder factory wiped an entire neighborhood off the map. The world began to understand that true strength no longer depended on the size of an army, but on the quality of the chemical mixture created by people like that monk. At first the Church looked with suspicion at such dangerous experiments taking place under its roofs. Soon, however, it adopted these discoveries in order to defend its borders and to expand its influence when needed. The monk could never have imagined that a small spark in his vessel would become a vast fire that burned millions of human beings across many centuries. From that moment, the story of gunpowder and fire and iron began to unfold as one long chapter of human history. Manuscripts from the monastery of St. Gallen tell that one of the monks who carried out these experiments lost his sight in a failed attempt. In many Arabic sources, saltpeter was known as Chinese salt, and scholars in the Islamic world had also worked to improve it before it reached Europe in its final form. The cursed genius of the European monk lay in his effort to calculate the rate of burning and to turn it into directed mechanical pressure. We are speaking of thousands of hours of exhausting experiment in narrow rooms where the sunlight almost never entered. He measured weights with extreme care, using tiny scales that could not tolerate even the slightest error. Any small increase in the percentage of sulfur changed the mixture into a dull cloud of smoke that did nothing of value. Any increase in potassium nitrate made the explosion more violent than the copper vessels could safely bear. This delicate balance led Bacon to feel that he had discovered a hidden secret of the universe locked inside these simple materials. In the 14th century, European cities began to compete in building gigantic cannons that were known by names meaning destroyers. These bombards were cast from the metal of melted church bells, literally transforming instruments of worship into instruments of annihilation. Many history books say that the fall of Constantinople was an almost inevitable result of this technological race that had begun with a monk in his workshop. The huge cannon used there weighed many tons and needed hundreds of oxen to drag it into position. The sight of its projectile lifting from the mouth of the barrel was enough to paralyze defenders long before it smashed the walls. Common people in the Middle Ages sometimes believed that the day of judgment had arrived when they heard the roar of such explosions. The monk who had once searched for a path to physical immortality thus found himself symbolically responsible for building one of the largest cemeteries in human history. Sources say that near the end of his life, Roger Bacon felt deep regret and tried to destroy some of his papers. By then, however, the genie had already escaped from the bottle, and no authority could return this knowledge to secrecy. The recipe spread like fire and dry straw among competing states, and the age of gunpowder began, lasting for many generations. Imagine ships cutting through the seas while carrying tons of this dangerous black powder in their holds. A single spark from the impact of two pieces of metal could explode a ship and everyone on board, turning timbers into drifting wreckage. Sailors lived lives surrounded by constant danger, not only from wind and wave, but also from the mixture that was both blessed and cursed at the same time. The historian Hugh Jones, in his book, Weapon and Society, explains that gunpowder forced states to build large bureaucracies in order to finance continuous wars. Taxes were gathered to supply raw materials, to purchase chemicals, and to build foundries for casting ever larger and stronger cannons. The political structure of the world changed under the pressure of a discovery that had begun almost by accident in the laboratory of a single monk. Bacon had believed that alchemy was a kind of sacred language of the divine in nature. He did not realize that humanity would one day turn that language into a cry of pain rising from battlefields. It took many decades for the bombs to become smaller, more precise, and easier to carry on the shoulder. In the year 1455, early muskets began to appear in the hands of infantry soldiers. These weapons were extremely heavy and required a constantly burning match cord to ignite the charge. Soldiers walked through battlefields carrying open flame in the darkness, which made them easy targets at night. Yet the psychological effect of the new sound of bullets cutting through the air was enough to scatter armies that outnumbered them many times over. Here we see clearly how knowledge, once it falls into human hands, tends to transform into a tool of control and domination. The monk who spent his nights in prayer spent his days mixing materials that would eventually turn human life into a kind of earthly hell. He used a mortar made of hard marble to grind his ingredients, because a metal tool might create a spark that would kill him instantly. This care and precision in handling dangerous substances marked the early beginnings of modern experimental science. Sources indicate that Bacon himself imagined that gunpowder could be used peacefully in mines to blast rocks in open tunnels. But kings and princes saw in it something different, a short road to breaking the thrones and walls of their enemies. History tells us that the world before gunpowder was a world of face-to-face clashes, where warriors met each other under the same sky and within the same range of vision. After its arrival, death began to come from unseen places, and from distances too great for the eye to follow. This transformation was the first seed for the later development of rockets and eventually nuclear bombs. Everything started from that small point in the corner of the monk laboratory, where three simple materials touched each other for the first time in a precise way. In 1520, records show one of the first uses of hand grenades made of glass and filled with gunpowder. These grenades exploded and sent out glass fragments that caused wounds that could hardly be treated with the medicine of that time. This kind of weapon was the result of improving the monk formula and adding new substances that increased its destructive power. Historian Hugh Trevor Roper writes that gunpowder served as one of the main engines of the scientific awakening in Europe. The need to improve artillery encouraged the growth of mathematics, physics, and the study of metals. Thus the monk did not only create a new explosive, he laid down one of the foundation stones of the modern material civilization. With every line we write about this story, we find ourselves in front of an endless chain of events linked to that first experiment. From distilling strange liquids in glass vessels to demolishing fortresses, from quiet prayers in the sanctuary to desperate cries in the trenches, the path stretches without a clear end. The story did not stop with the death of the monk. The bloodiest chapters, in fact, began centuries after he left the world. I imagine 19th century scientists looking at the manuscripts of Bacon with deep amazement. They wondered how a man living in what they considered a dark age could reach such clear scientific insights. Bacon believed that knowledge is a form of power that can raise the human condition. He did not imagine that this same power would be used in ways that weakened humanity and scattered its communities. In the year 1605, a group of conspirators tried to blow up the building of the English Parliament using 36 barrels of gunpowder. This event, known in history as the Gunpowder Plot, shows how the weapon had moved from the hand of the king into the hands of rebels. It became possible for a single determined person to destroy the very center of authority using the technique first explored by a quiet monk. The details of the plot reveal the level of fear that rulers now felt in a world where black powder could overturn their power in a single night. Gunpowder was stored in hidden basements under guards more watchful than those placed over gold. Gold could buy a kingdom, but gunpowder could protect that kingdom or erase it. In this way we see that the monk did not create a mere chemical substance. He redesigned the meaning of power in human history. For centuries the world continued to breathe the smoke of gunpowder before dynamite and more modern explosives appeared. All these later developments, whether seen as blessings or curses, owe their origin to that moment when the monk mixed the three ingredients together. Sources say that he wore rough woolen clothes to reduce the risk of static electricity that might ignite the powder without warning. He worked in almost complete silence, far from curious eyes and from the agents of inquisitorial courts. He was aware that what he held between his hands was a secret of life and death combined in a single stone mortar. That is how the beginning looked, and that is how the shape of the world we live in today was carved out of the runes left behind by that discovery. The process of producing this ominous powder inside the halls of the monastery was not a pleasant scientific game. It was a continuous ritual of chemical hardship and danger. Roger Bacon spent long months collecting the delicate flowers of salt that formed on the damp walls of caves and in the channels of underground water. This material, which we now call potassium nitrate, became the lung of the bomb, allowing the fire to breathe even in deep tunnels and in the very heart of the sea. Before this discovery, the world had never known a substance that could burn so easily in the absence of ordinary air. It was as if fire had finally found a way to carry its own breath with it, wherever it went. The monk would wash these salts again and again with distilled water, then slowly evaporate the liquid at carefully measured temperatures, so the crystals kept their explosive nature. He treated each degree of heat with respect, knowing that too much would weaken the powder and too little would leave it impure and unreliable. After that he needed to search for pure yellow sulfur, brought from volcanic regions in southern Europe and in the lands of Italy. In his mind, sulfur was the cursed medium that linked spirit and matter and made rapid ignition possible. As for the charcoal, it was made from the wood of willow trees only, because its pores allowed the fire to spread through it at the fastest possible speed. The choice of tree was not random. It was the result of long observation of how different woods burned crumbled, and carried the flame. Imagine the monk grinding these three ingredients together after moistening them with a little liquid to avoid a sudden explosion in his hands. He kneaded them into a black paste, then left it to dry before breaking it into tiny grains of different sizes for different uses. He discovered that the larger grains suited huge cannons that needed a slower, more powerful burn, while fine powder worked best for small bombs and hand-thrown charges. Step by step, his careful experiments turned into a complete science of grain size and burning speed. In the book that would later be known as The Policy of War by the thinker Clausewitz, this moment is described as the one that erased the idea of noble chivalry from history. A simple peasant with no training in the arts of combat could now kill a knight who had spent 20 years learning how to wield a sword. With a single pull of the trigger of a crude musket loaded with the monk-black powder, the age of individual heroism came to an end. Glory moved from the strength of the arm to the strength of the mixture hidden inside the barrel. In the year 1485, bombs began to take the form of hollow metal spheres filled with powder and packed with fragments. Soldiers lit a long fuse and threw them toward crowded enemy lines, where they exploded and turned the battlefield into a sea of screams and torn limbs. Sources such as the Chronicles of the City of Venice mention that its people believed the sky was raining fire when this technique was used against their ships. They had no language yet for such destruction, so they saw it as a sign of anger from above. The world was no longer a place for dialogue or formal duels fought under agreed rules. It became a space ruled by whoever owned the largest chemical factories and powder mills. The monk had hoped that this discovery would be a divine force that could help open mountain roads and make human life easier. Instead, he was shocked when he saw generals snatching his pages so they could turn them into tables that estimated the number of dead per square mile. What he had written as careful notes of experiment became columns of predicted casualties in the hands of men of power. At that time, the Church forbade the spread of these sciences among ordinary people and treated them as state secrets of the highest level. Any alchemist who revealed the formula of the mixture could be tortured to death, because powder meant survival for empires and rulers. Historian Peter Frankopan, in his work on the Roads of Silk, confirms that powder was the real currency with which Europe bought its domination of the world. Before that, many Asian and Muslim kingdoms were ahead in civilization and knowledge, but the weapon of the monk overturned the balance. Cannons mounted on the backs of ships forced coastal cities to surrender without a single full land battle. Fortified ports that once felt safe fell after hours of bombardment from the sea. In one of his manuscripts, known as the Letter of the Secret, Bacon even predicted the appearance of vehicles that could move without horses thanks to controlled explosions. He had imagined the idea of an internal combustion engine 6 centuries before it was built, but history seemed more eager to perfect killing than to perfect transport. Detailed notes show that the monk tested the strength of his explosions by placing small, measured amounts of powder under large stones to see how far they moved. He recorded these results in secret notebooks using complex Latin numbers that only he and his closest pupils could understand. By the year 1564, bombs had begun to take the form of explosive heads launched from mortar to fall behind enemy lines. This kind of weapon was called the fire of hell, because soldiers could not protect themselves from it by hiding behind earthen walls. The military historian John Keegan, in his book about the face of battle, explains that the smell of sulfur terrified soldiers even before any explosion took place. Many believed that this smell was proof of the presence of demons on the battlefield, which led to waves of nervous collapse among men who could not endure what they saw. The world was not yet accustomed to this kind of widespread destruction that did not distinguish between young and old. Early bombs exploded unpredictably and often killed the gunners themselves as they misjudged distances and timing. Yet the pursuit of power drove kings to sacrifice thousands of workers in mines and factories to supply the monk precious materials. The history of gunpowder is in many ways the history of a shift from valuing human quality to calculating material quantity. In 1684, the first battle was recorded in which crude cluster bombs were used during the siege of Vienna. These devices exploded in the air and scattered hundreds of small burning balls that set fire to everything they touched. The world gradually turned into a giant laboratory for developing killing techniques that had begun with the monk in the corner of his monastery. Historian Niall Ferguson notes that powder created the modern state because it made war so expensive that only strong central rulers could wage it. The authority of minor nobles faded as power and weapons were concentrated under larger flags that controlled giant arsenals. In the last days of his life, Bacon said that the human mind might one day invent something capable of destroying the entire planet. His words were not empty imagination. They were a deep understanding of the logical chain of ever-increasing explosions. Today we live in the shadow of that first spark that a monk lit while searching for a path to immortality. He found instead that he had opened a door to endless destruction, whose echo still rings in every bullet fired and in every bomb that explodes. His last message before his death warned that fire never feels full, and that powder is only the beginning of the story, not its end. The movement of powder from the laboratories of monasteries into the wooden hulls of seagoing ships was a declaration of the absolute control of humankind over the surface of the earth. By the end of the 15th century, in the year 1492, European powers began to equip their fleets with crude bronze cannons. This change meant that a ship was no longer just a vessel for trade. It had become a floating fortress capable of erasing coastal towns from maps in minutes. Spanish historian Fernández de Oviedo writes that the terror caused by the bombs in the mines of the people of the New World was deadlier than the iron projectiles themselves. Roger Bacon had left behind notes on how to increase explosive pressure by lengthening cannon tubes to achieve greater range. Before this, sea battles relied on ramming ships against each other and then boarding with swords and knives on the decks. The monk bomb made it possible for fighting to begin and end at distances of hundreds of meters without the soldier ever touching or even clearly seeing his opponent. Imagine the salty haze mixing with thick black powder smoke that completely hid the view from the crews of the ships. In the year 1589, the world witnessed a new development after the discovery of a pure form of sulfur in the mines of Sicily. This purity led to the creation of what was called corned powder, which did not absorb sea moisture as easily as older, loose powders. Historian Hugh Trevor Roper notes in his writings that this development was the key that opened the doors of global colonial expansion. The world began to split into those who possessed the secret of the monk and mastered the mathematics of projectiles, and those who stood helpless before these human thunderbolts. During those years, the workshops of monasteries in Germany and France worked like secret arms factories, supplying armies with ever more destructive recipes. The monk Berthold Schwarz, who came after Bacon, drew one of the first designs for a mortar that could lob bombs in a high curve to fall in the middle of cities. People thought the sound of these weapons was the anger of heaven, not realizing that it was the result of grinding simple substances together in a dark cellar. History books such as The Story of Science by Will Durant explain that the amount of powder used in the 16th century multiplied 100-fold compared to earlier times. This increase changed the architecture of cities, as tall, thin walls disappeared and low, thick, star-shaped fortresses appeared instead. Engineers spent their lives trying to design angles and bastions that could absorb the shock of the bombs born from the monk experiments. In 1623, the first use of primitive land mines, based on Bacon principle, was recorded. These devices were placed under castle gates and detonated from a distance using long fuses made of linen soaked in nitrates. The precision that alchemists reached at that time made explosions more focused and much more powerful. Monks experimented with adding metal shavings to powder so that blasts would throw out burning sparks that water could not easily extinguish. This development led to entire wooden cities being burned within a few hours of continuous shelling. Military historian Max Boot writes that powder carved the geography of the modern world, shaping which empires expanded and which disappeared. Without that bomb, small European powers could never have imposed their control on vast continents such as the Americas and Africa. Before this age, the world lived in a rough balance based on the number of people and the size of armies, but the monk gave the few a weapon that crushed the many. Manuscripts from the monastery of Bari say that one of the monks who tested these materials suffered permanent deafness from the constant thunder of explosions. He lived in complete isolation, surrounded by barrels of rock salt and bottles of sulfur, as if he were waiting for something terrible and inevitable. He mixed the materials with trembling fingers, fully aware that the smallest mistake could turn his body into a handful of ash blown away by the wind. Detailed accounts explain that powder was stored in rooms lined with thick felt to prevent any friction that might create a fatal spark. In 1794, the French Academy of Sciences published a study that restored credit to the monks for laying the foundations of modern chemistry through these experiments. The price, however, was heavy, as chemistry shifted from a science aimed at serving humanity to a science often employed to destroy it. By the 18th century, bombs were being manufactured in many sizes to suit every type of military mission. There were incendiary bombs designed to destroy crops and food supplies, and shattering bombs that tore the chests of horses on race grounds and battlefields. Bacon had mentioned in a marginal note that this substance might one day be used to make machines that could fly in the sky. He meant rockets, which began as toys for kings and turned into tools for distant bombardment. The story of this monk is therefore a story of curiosity that knew no limits, a gift that can be blessing or curse depending on who holds the trigger. Imagine the silent monastery on a cold night when the flames suddenly erupt and light the sky with a strange purple glow. That color was the result of incomplete burning of salts, and country folk believed the monk was speaking with spirits. They did not know that he was reaching a scientific result that would shape the destiny of the world for the next 500 years. Historian Hugh Trevor Roper confirms that the revolution of powder was the greatest challenge humanity faced after the discovery of agriculture. It forced states to develop administratively and technically just to guarantee a steady flow of this dangerous substance. In the year 1864, the age of traditional black powder effectively came to an end, and the age of modern chemical explosives began. But the foundation that Alfred Nobel built upon when he invented dynamite was the same foundation laid by the monk in his 13th century cell. The world today, with all its technological and military progress, still owes its reality to that accidental moment when a man of religion mixed 3 simple powders. Every time we hear the echo of an explosion, we can remember that monk who dreamed of life and ended up giving the world death wrapped in smoke. Thus humanity moved from the edges of swords to the heart of bombs, and a bloody journey that began with a search for immortality and ended with warehouses full of ashes. The story as a whole is a scientific tragedy in which the desire for power overwhelmed the wish for pure knowledge. Now tell me, what do you think of this monk who created death while he was searching for life? Do you see his discovery as a historical necessity that led to the development of science and civilization, or as a cursed coincidence that opened the gates of torment upon humanity? Write your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you for listening and for staying with us here on Sleeping Radio.